Hi, I'm Hamish Black, and welcome to Writing on Games. If you look up IGN's review of 2015's Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, you'll find a tale in media res describing a perilous prisoner extraction with the threat of sunrise looming. But thanks to a combination of preparedness and explosive improvisation by colliding various game systems together, our heroic writer was able to complete his mission with a thoroughly enjoyable narrative playing out, and crucially, a narrative that was his own, that the game had allowed him to create. Moreover, he begins his review in earnest by stating, "That's the Phantom Pain almost all the time." And you know, 2 years ago when the game first released, I agreed with him and the cavalcade of reviewers stating much the same thing. Now though, my thoughts could more accurately be represented as, if he's talking about how the Phantom Pain is all the time, why isn't this review just the words trank pistol, headshot, Fulton repeated ad infinitum? That is to say, a lot can change in a couple of years. Back in 2015, and as a long-time Metal Gear fanatic, I could not have been more hyped for this game. In fact, I struggle to remember feeling as excited for any other release ever. Grand Theft Auto 5 came close, but still not to the level of staying up all night nervously waiting for the Steam unlock at 5 AM, cursing my slow-ass internet connection waiting for the download to complete, then gleefully sacrificing sleep, food, and human contact as I ploughed through the game in about 50 hours or so. As I made my two-part video review on the game, some of the earliest videos on this channel now long unlisted to make way for this more comprehensive analysis, I recalled loving every second of it, spouting similar talking points to those presented in reviews from more established outlets. How this was the best stealth game I have ever played, noting the astounding scale of the open world, how the gameplay options afforded to players were substantial and necessary and allowed me to create my own stories, defending the game's own storytelling as saying more by saying less, and at one point even uttering the phrase, "It's the Dark Souls of stealth games," and for the record, I will never not be ashamed of that. I did mention that some changes to series tradition didn't work, but never really referenced those at any point. Those were bad videos, badly produced, ill-informed takes on a game that has rightly garnered a great deal of criticism from pundits and downright derision from players since. Like I say, I had sacrificed a lot of sleep to make those videos. I was tired, ill, and this was the first time I had truly binged a game like this for the sake of the channel. As time went on, I started to get the feeling that the conditions under which I played the game were not dissimilar to the now infamous Konami boot camp event, where journalists played the game supervised for a set amount of time before hurriedly writing their reviews. And as that time continued to go on, I began to feel more and more like that was far from the ideal way to consume or criticise media of any kind. All of this contextual spiel is to say that the Phantom Pain for me was a lesson in how not to be a critic. As fellow YouTuber Super Bunny Hop so eloquently pointed out in his video on the game, the best way to fail as a critic is to say something is perfect without explaining why, and I definitely fell foul of that. So as penance to cathartically rid myself of that critical dead weight, I decided to dive back in 2 years later to delete my 98% complete save, after a great deal of wrangling thanks to Konami's asinine save system, and fairly analyse the game in two parts, one focusing on gameplay and the other on story just like before, sans any form of hype, putting another 100 or so hours in over the space of a couple of months rather than a few days. The result? Almost a complete shift in my initial perspective. As opposed to thinking of the Phantom Pain as one of the best stealth games ever made, I saw the botched potential for what should have been the best stealth game ever made. My experience was utterly infuriating. The Phantom Pain's design is more confused than I could have ever previously envisioned, adding surprisingly little to the series that previous games weren't already abundant in, and what's more, functioning as the least interesting way to tell a story that absolutely didn't need to be told. In other words, the Phantom Pain is a game that did not need to exist, and in this two-part breakdown, I'm going to explain why. Or at least I'm going to try to. Really, producing an analysis of this game has been one of the most difficult things I've ever done on this channel, because there's so much that it does wrong that it's really hard to know where to begin. In the same way its maelstrom of interwoven systems are supposed to seamlessly coexist, every problem the game has contributes to and compounds the other problems. I guess the through line of it all, however, the problem at the core of both the gameplay and the narrative, is precisely this shift to the open design that was so lauded as the game's main strength upon its release. Indeed, Metal Gear Solid Go's open world was also plastered all over the marketing of the game, with trailers showing an experience that was far grander in scope than previous Metal Gear games, which, aside from perhaps Peace Walker on portable systems, were fairly aggressively linear experiences. Whereas previous games would take you from scene to scene and bog you down with long stretches of uninteractive cutscenes, leading many to comment that Metal Gear was a series you watched rather than played, the Phantom Pain placed control of all of this in your hands. You chose which missions you wanted to do and when, how you carried them out thanks to a new open world, and the wealth of new tools at your disposal, as well as the new functionality afforded to previously available tools, how much focus you placed on the story, all of it. On top of that though, the game seemed to take more cues from Peace Walker than any other Metal Gear in its emphasis on base and micromanagement. Following the events of its prequel Ground Zeroes, in which Mother Base, the oil rig without a nation you built in Peace Walker, was destroyed, it would be your job to rebuild it and the army it housed, taking it from the glorified menu screen it was in Peace Walker to a physical, hulking structure you could actually inhabit. The army of diamond dogs you built up by recruiting soldiers from the battlefield would subsequently support you by developing new tools, providing intel, and supplying you with weapons and items as and when you needed them. In keeping with the theme of maintaining the player's role at the centre of the experience, the game's story was to take a more serious approach, tackling more deeply themes like child soldiers, the dangers of nuclear war, and the cost of revenge. Not only darker themes than previous games had perhaps handled, but more singular in nature, presumably allowing for the game to approach them more directly than the often convoluted themes of information control and the nature of genetics other games fumbled through. What's more, this was all meant to be the final piece of the puzzle, closing out the series by answering the question on everyone's minds: just how did Big Boss, the character we've controlled for multiple games, turn into a villain? Everything seemed like it was in the game's favour, an experience that prioritised self-expression and improvisatory tactics in missions would lead to the ultimate stealth game, and thanks to the story, the ultimate Metal Gear game. How did that turn out then? Well, let's go through a typical scenario the Phantom Pain presents you with, and by typical I mean basically the only situation you're presented with after a few hours. So you run uninterrupted across a kilometre of desolate land after waiting for minutes for your helicopter to drop you off because there's no effective means of fast travel. You picked your loadout prior from dozens of potential weapons, but obviously you went for the starting trank pistol, or trank sniper rifle if you developed it, because at this stage you've established it's objectively the best strategy. Along your travels you maybe come across an outpost with 4 or 5 guards, D-Dog pinpoints their exact location, or you send Quiet in to scout ahead. Again, objectively best strategy. You line up 4 or 5 headshots from a distance, knocking everyone out instantly. Either that, or you Rambo your way through to make lining those headshots up easier. You extract the guards to make the numbers on Mother Base bigger, or you just avoid what little challenge exists here entirely by running around it. After proceeding to your main objective and performing that same series of events on a slightly larger scale, you destroy or extract whatever it was you were in there for before calling in a helicopter and waiting a few more minutes for the mission to end. Sometimes there's a boss fight. Without exaggeration, that is almost every mission beyond the 10-hour mark. And let me emphasize this, the Phantom Pain can last you upwards of 100 hours. Suffice to say, it can be torturous. What makes it all the more painful though is that those first 10 hours or so are truly fantastic and show what the game could have been. The intro sets the scene perfectly. While older games tend to throw you into the action immediately, Kojima and co take their time here. They place you in a position of limited control, but force you to experience everything as Snake does, out of time and unable to get his bearings, emphasizing his lack of understanding of the situation. It lines up with the player's thoughts and intentions. We want to know more while also having no idea of what's going to happen when shit hits the fan and we're forced to act. While the whole sequence is basically on rails, it's a roller coaster ride, throwing everything at you that you would expect from a Metal Gear game in concentrated form. You have the haunting visuals of supernatural beings wreaking havoc, bolstered by the absolutely gorgeous Fox engine and Kojima's continued flair for framing a shot. You have the nail-biting tension of hoping that you don't get caught with no idea of what lies around the next corner, followed by the release of finding out that, in true MGS fashion, the answer is probably a goddamn flaming man or something. All topped off with a subtle but absurd sense of humour. The idea, for example, that these men just bombarded the man on fire with missiles, bullets, everything, but they never thought to just, turn on the sprinklers. As far as first hours of a video game go, it's a pretty fucking wild first hour of a video game. What's great is that a lot of the same ideas are represented in the following few missions. Snake, and by extension the player, are given very little time to breathe. You're simply told that Kaz has been caught, you've got to go get him and rebuild Mother Base, and that time is of the essence. It's a refreshingly snappy approach to getting you into the game proper, without a whole bunch of expository dialogue. You're told how to mark things, where you can find intel on Kaz's location, and then you're just kind of let loose on this desolate landscape. You're forced to confront systems you don't fully understand yet. You have no idea where guards could be, what they can see, how common their patrols are, or even how time of day affects things. It makes a change from the distinctly video gamey notion of little dots unable to see out with the confines of the little blue cone. You're in broad daylight and will likely react somewhat vampirically, diving to the side of your horse the minute you see soldiers riding by. And it's here that you start to realise the extent to which Snake's moveset has expanded, and how responsive everything feels. You scout ahead using your scope to mark enemies, but you're never sure if you got them all and can only make plans based on your limited perspective. You keep your belly to the ground, attempting to make as little noise as possible, testing out the range and effectiveness of your tranquilizer pistol before its silencer's durability runs out, at which point you have to experiment with different methods, either avoiding combat entirely, taking the lethal approach, or CQC. With the latter, you're given an option to interrogate, at which point you're greeted with Ocelot reminding you that you don't speak their language. In every way, you're left to your own devices here, and it feels exhilaratingly organic in a way that perhaps previous Metal Gear Solid intros did not. The mission's requirement that you go to one location to get the intel before retrieving Kaz not only highlights the size of the map, but importantly makes good use of it by forcing you to adapt to different locations. The Wax-In barracks are largely flat, with numerous buildings for you to enter, as well as spaces where enemies could be hiding. The Guandai Car, on the other hand, is sloped and more open, with the enemy holding the higher ground and therefore the advantage in the situation. On top of that though, you perhaps think to yourself, if I was to play this mission again, just how much of a requirement would that intel be? Or could I just go and find Kaz immediately? Do that and the game rewards you in the form of the ranking you receive after missions, which seems to depend largely on the time you take to complete the mission. If you can get in and out quickly by exploring different strategies that may seem broken on first glance, the game seems to recognise that. Once you find Kaz and take him to the extraction point, probably after messing up a couple of times as you get used to how guards work, the boss characters you'll see the most in the game make a surprise appearance: the Skull's Parasite Unit. Essentially zombified super soldiers, their terrifying appearance and uncanny movement make them seem like something out of a horror game rather than a stealth action title. What's more, given your relative newness to the game, your instinct is likely to be avoid at all costs. Again, the game tells you to deal with them however you choose, and in a style reminiscent of immersive sims like Deus Ex, that instinctual avoidance is something the game recognises. You can run past these guys if you want. You'll almost certainly get spotted thanks to their blocking of the bridge, which itself leads you to hammering on the go faster horse button as these monsters leap directly in front of you while pulsing synths drive home the urgency of the situation. Seriously, Phantom Limbs is about as effective an introductory mission as you could hope for out of a game like this. It highlights the scale of the world, the potential scope of the game's systems, and allows you to figure out the boundaries of those systems yourself. Most importantly though, it makes the world feel unpredictable, unsafe. It feels like even your most fully realised plans could fall through and require some improvisation. And it's this notion of always feeling just slightly outgunned that makes any stealth game effective. The idea that the enemy could overwhelm you to the point that avoiding them entirely is preferable to engaging them head on. In a means similar to survival horror games, it's about things like resource management, of knowing that your suppressor could run out, and a tactic you could otherwise rely on suddenly becoming useless. Ultimately though, it's about being made to feel small, and the size of the open world certainly helps with that, at least initially. You really feel like you're in the open, like you could be spotted at any time. And as such, even if you're not infiltrating a particular base, you always feel like an intruder. Essentially, in order to make an open world stealth game effective, you need to ensure two things: player vulnerability and that the world remains at least somewhat unpredictable. And the early sections of the Phantom Pain illustrate an acute understanding of this. This is why I say that the first 10 hours or so of the Phantom Pain are great. There are still new places to explore, new systems to be introduced to, with missions such as C2W introducing the idea of destroying comms equipment to disorient guards, Where Do the Bees Sleep tasking you with infiltrating a vast open area leaving you vulnerable, etc. You get to grips with Snake's extended moveset and the mechanical possibilities afforded to even old series staples. For example, where previously a cardboard box would act as something of a novelty item with one purpose, here you can pop out to shoot unsuspecting guards. You can use it as a means of transportation, jump out to leave the box as a decoy of sorts, and a whole lot more. Unfortunately though, as I progressed through my second playthrough, I found myself heavily disagreeing with the commonly held belief that the Phantom Pain is the best a Metal Gear game has actually played. It's honestly, and bear with me here, the same problem that No Man's Sky had. The first few planets feel new, exotic, and kind of terrifying, until you realise that every planet is functionally the same, and the game's systems only help to make that world feel small and synthetic. This is because despite how well it controls, the Phantom Pain's overall design completely negates any progress made in that regard, laying the groundwork for an objectively dominant strategy as early as your return to Mother Base. Slowly but surely, the game morphs into a repetitive mess that feels scared to truly commit to its open-ended design, perhaps ironically ending up as the most restrictive an MGS game has ever been. It all begins once you rescue Kaz. You're reminded that in order to achieve your true goal of getting revenge on the sod apes that left your last house all twunted, you have to first rebuild your army, as well as the oil rig they'll live on. Initially, the idea of developing something physically imposing to represent your progression through the game is neat. It lines up with the emphasis on self-expression placed on the gameplay. You're building something that's yours. This is your army, your base, and it's growing as you grow. And while the structure itself proves to be more symbolic than functional, the impact its underlying systems have on gameplay are fundamental, perhaps to the game's biggest fault. See, Mother Base's key purpose is to provide you with support in your missions, developing new weapons and items, providing intel, going out on resource gathering missions, etc. Each facet of Mother Base is strengthened based on how many soldiers you bring back via the Fulton recovery system, leading to an interesting shift in the way you view the notion of non-lethality in a stealth game. It's a method that's often encouraged in the genre for sure. It's quiet and it's clean. In older MGS games, even if an unconscious body was discovered by a guard, they'd be woken up and that might be the end of it. A dead body, however, would be reported, making life more difficult for the player. In the Phantom Pain though, non-lethality isn't that abstract. It's concretely linked to your progression. A dead soldier isn't going to be developing much for you. Even an injured soldier might not survive the hilariously absurd balloon trip. Your goal then is ensuring you keep your enemies alive and in one piece. Soldiers aren't necessarily enemies anymore, they're potential allies. And this could have been great. Like your suppressor's durability, your Fulton supply is limited. It can be increased through upgrades, but you're always going to run out at some point. This could have led to the player making decisions about who to extract based on their skill level or how well protected they were, while also having to figure out other methods of dealing with the remaining troops that you were unable to extract. Through forcing the player to manage resources, the game would encourage more diverse improvisatory styles of play, leading to the emergent moments of self-expression the open world feels built for. Unfortunately though, the game absolutely does not work this way. Your supply of Fultons, suppressors, anything isn't really limited. From that second mission, you can basically extract everyone, and it almost never makes sense to do anything else. This is because another key function of Mother Base is the supply drop, which, for a small amount of GMP, the game's main currency earned through missions, allows you to fully restock your ammo and items at any time. And with that one feature, things begin to get a bit messy. Now, if you don't extract soldiers, the numbers don't go up, you don't get access to things like increased map accuracy or material gathering, for example. Life is made harder for you if you don't collect soldiers. The issue is when you have no reason not to, when durability is only limited by a readily available currency and your patience to wait for a supply drop, and allows you to extract soldiers, why would you ever use anything other than the silenced pistol? I wasn't saving my suppressor out of the preservationist fear of finding myself unprepared for future enemy encounters. It was the arbitrary amount of time the game made me wait to receive another suppressor. Whatever grandiose plans you might have envisioned may be bombastic, fun, even cinematic in the way the series has always strived to be. But to enact those plans is to kill or miss out on those precious soldiers, those numbers used to build your bigger number back at Mother Base, to improve your character. Everything becomes a numbers game. The amount of soldiers you recruit, the stats of those soldiers, the time you're waiting for things to happen, etc. What once seemed like an organic, unpredictable open world is reduced to a series of visible clockwork systems. Getting caught off guard by a patrol doesn't instill the fear that it should, or encourage the player to be more careful in the open world. The player just sees them as numbers. And thanks to the game's other systems, this dominant strategy is only made easier for you. As you progress, you gain access to different buddies, characters that accompany you on missions, each with their own abilities and upgrades unlocked based on how much you use them. Again, this should act as another means of planning for and adapting to different situations, but nah. Once you extract and witness the admittedly adorable scenes of D-Dog growing up, you take him into a mission and find that he marks every enemy in your vicinity. Remember the good old days where you'd at least have to put a little bit of effort to scope out a base before bolting in and extracting everything? Not anymore. Now every soldier is less than a number. It's an item on a checklist for you to tick off. Things only get worse when you unlock Quiet. Not only does she possess the same enemy marking abilities as D-Dog, once you use her enough, you can unlock a silenced, tranquilized sniper rifle so you don't even have to do the shooting yourself anymore. Soldiers might spot her and attempt to take her out, but then she just moves to a different point to continue the process. And then you have Reflex mode. Gone is the instantaneous transition from hidden to spotted that you received in previous games. The action slows down dramatically, an urgent pulse pierces through the silence you've been trying to maintain, and a dude shouts, "Project!" before all hell breaks loose. The first time it happened to me, it was a mixture of immediate terror followed by sustained dread, as I both panicked about my next move and awaited the consequences of my mistake. The 10th time it happened to me, however, I realised what function it actually served: to alleviate that mistake. And boy, does it give you a large opportunity to do so. Far from increasing the stakes, you hit the left trigger to zap round to the enemy who spotted you, while your aim actually steadies, giving you the perfect line of fire for a headshot on helmeted guards, for instance. In main missions, your grade can be affected by triggering reflex mode, but given the ranking's emphasis on completion time over much else, this is honestly unlikely. In side missions though, you aren't ranked, which can lead to fairly absurd scenarios in which you throw caution to the wind, bolting into heavily guarded bases and going from reflex trigger to reflex trigger, blasting through and putting everyone to bed very, very slowly. At every stage, it feels like the game is scared to just let you handle things yourself, as the more open design is screaming for. You can turn these things off. You can choose to turn off reflex mode or enter a mission without a buddy, but to do so feels so arbitrary. While we'll get into the game's story in the next video, most missions lack even the most basic of context within the overall narrative, leading them to blur together regardless of the objective, regardless of whether it's a main or a side op. With very few exceptions, each mission tasks you with extracting or destroying something, because in most cases, you're still a military for hire and you'd have to do jobs, I guess. And while it's novel in an early mission like A Hero's Way to realise that the soldiers you've been tasked with killing can be extracted for your own benefit, you soon realise that this is the case with every mission, so the novelty wears off fast. Why would you kill someone or destroy something when you could so easily use it yourself? After a while, every mission follows this same template, and the repetition isn't helped by the structure of the open world itself. While I originally justified the size of the Afghanistan map as thematically consistent, it really feels like an endless desert, man. Upon reinspection, it's as needlessly desolate as everyone said it was. Given how little danger you're actually in from being ambushed in the open world, you quickly realise how long you spend just running around this bland environment. In fact, to call the world open feels like a bit of a misnomer. Each base you infiltrate essentially functions as any environment or room would in a previous Metal Gear game, presenting you with different challenges even if the way you entered and exited those environments was fairly limited. Whereas those games, however, kept you moving from MGS moment to MGS moment at a fairly brisk pace, the Phantom Pain ends up just feeling like more of a massive overworld with potential MGS moments sprinkled here and there, but which forces you to run the ungodly distances between them. I mean, you could always call in the helicopter and wait the several minutes for it to fly in, load, select another mission, select your loadout, more loading, then an unskippable cutscene as you fly in, but that takes so much time it's unconscionable. What's more, side ops are so sparsely laid out that it often takes upwards of 5 to 10 minutes to run to them. Compare this to Peace Walker, from which the game takes most of its influence. You select a mission from a menu, you start, you complete the mission, and Snake Fultons himself out of there. You'd be done and out in a few minutes, as opposed to the goddamn commitment you need to make in the Phantom Pain to take out the Armoured Unit 97 or whatever meaningless shite you're trying to do. Why wasn't the self-Fulton an option here outside of material containers? My guess is that they wanted something more grounded and realistic, but this is also a game in which you light your vape rig with an iPad in the 80s. Hell, you can upgrade the Fulton to a goddamn wormhole. I'm fairly sure people would have been okay with a little absurdity in a Metal Gear game. What makes this all the more egregious is the fact that you could have just completed a side op in one location and remembered that location is used for your next main op. When you select that main op from the menu, however, the game will send you to a completely arbitrary point on the map, even if you're precisely where the mission takes place, I guess because that's not where the mission starts, dingus. And so, sans any reasonable fast travel system, you run all the way over there, only to immediately run all the way back, avoiding outposts altogether because you reach a stage where engagement is pointless, through the same bland environments, getting caught on weird geometry because Snake doesn't feel like he was built for anything other than a flat horizontal surface, and getting lost far more than you should thanks to the map's approach to topology. Which is to say that this is seemingly the first open world post-Skyrim that eschews the exploratory notion of, see that mountain over there? You can climb it, in favour of, see that mountain over there? That's blocking your way to where you need to get to, so you need to figure out this needlessly complicated and specific series of roads in order to get around it. Just think about this for a second. This is an open world stealth game that completely trivializes stealth and makes getting anywhere the most difficult thing in the entire game. It makes you work in all the wrong ways. But then you get to mission 13, where you get to go to an entirely new environment, and you find that Africa is just a blander, flatter version of Afghanistan. This world is nowhere near as open as the game thinks it is. And the truly heartbreaking thing is, I really think things could have been so different were it not for the near unlimited supply drops. And I say near unlimited because technically if you go into GMP debt, the morale of your troops goes down, but apparently the effects of that are so minimal that some are calling the system broken. Yeah, it's not just the story that was unfinished here, guys. Your plans would differ based on things like guard placement and the geography of the base you were infiltrating, strategizing the ideal route through it. Your choice of buddy would depend on whether you had long stretches of land to traverse quickly, in which case you'd choose D-Horse, or if the area was more concentrated and you wanted to create a distraction on the other side of the map, in which case you'd choose Quiet. Maybe you would place a few bombs along the way, like your IGN reviewer talked about, an explosive backup measure should your current plan go awry. But nope, you go in with Quiet, get your headshots, balloon everything that isn't nailed down, then go get your main objective. If for some reason things do happen to go a bit pear-shaped, just run away and then come back when things have died down a bit, every single time. Talk all you want about older Metal Gear games feeling restrictive, but in my time with the Phantom Pain, I have never felt more railroaded into one style of play for such a protracted period of time. It's like, imagine in Resident Evil that if you got hurt, you could just run a kilometer away from the mansion where you know there are no zombies and wait a minute for a drop of ammo or herbs, or call in a sniper rifle and take them out from a distance. It would completely kill the claustrophobia and feeling of entrapment so vital to that game, and that's exactly what happens here. Older Metal Gear games acted as a test of your wits, your ingenuity against odds greater than yourself, using what limited tools you had in the most expressive way you could. The Phantom Pain, on the other hand, only serves to test your patience. It got to the stage in my second playthrough where I would crave any kind of surprise to break up the monotony, and to its credit, the game isn't entirely devoid of this kind of thing. It's just perhaps odd that the bits I found most interesting second time through were the parts most people decried upon its initial release. As soon as you notice that alert symbol on a seemingly innocuous side op to retrieve Huey, which then leads into a main mission with Quiet, I knew the bosses in this game would at least be somewhat interesting. Hell, the first time I fought Quiet, the only non-lethal weapon I had was my tranquilizer pistol, so I spent way longer than I'd like to admit, accounting for bullet drop across the entire arena, which felt really good when I finally pulled it off and took her down, even if the outcome is no different from the quote-unquote lethal approach. The Sahelanthropus fight is up there as maybe the best battle with a Metal Gear in the entire series. It's the biggest a boss fight has felt, with the now upright mech towering above you as the music stops and you're told, "Stop that thing!" The fight also utilises the size of the map in an interesting way, forcing you to move to different areas as you weave between supply drops and improvise cover from the rocky terrain. Aside from what feels like an unfair insta-kill attack later in the fight, it's appropriately fast-paced and explosive. That said, my favourite encounter with Sahelanthropus was actually far earlier, in the mission where you extract Huey. There's a beautiful weirdness inherent to out-stealthing a mech while carrying a guy on your shoulders, and it's as terrifying an encounter as it is uniquely creative within the scope of the entire game. The Skulls encounters aren't anywhere near as creative for sure. Simply placing you in an environment with 4 super soldiers on multiple occasions isn't exactly the most exhilarating scenario when compared to, say, fighting the ex-president in an octopus suit with samurai swords. I don't know though, I appreciated the sheer number of ways I could take them on, or not take them on as was often the case. Metallic Archaea is particularly egregious in that it only allows for direct confrontation, but even then it's urgent in a way that very few missions actually are, so at this point I'll take it. On the whole though, yeah, there aren't any bisexual vampires or fat guys on rollerblades to be found here. There aren't the dumb green health bars in the top left, and the encounters are often weaved more naturally into a mission's progression than being these big segmented set pieces. So I totally get the argument that the Phantom Pain's boss fights lack personality. But in terms of testing you on the skills you've internalized up to that point, the boss fights here are more subtle and effective than I think people give them credit for. Continuing the theme of defending the stuff most people didn't like though, the apparently rehashed missions in Chapter 2 that featured so prominently as one of the game's biggest drawbacks in most people's minds ended up feeling like a real breath of fresh air on my second playthrough. No longer was the utterly broken strategy of Trank Sniper Rifle and Quiet's Cover Me function viable. Suddenly, and after tens of hours of mastering the game's dominant playstyle, that mastery was taken away from me, along with all of my equipment in subsistence missions or the reflex mode in total stealth missions. Suddenly, things were tense again. I no longer viewed soldiers as numbers but as real, actual threats, hindrances to my previously automatic progress. For what felt like the first time since the game's early hours, I was truly vulnerable, and it felt great. It also led to some of the most self-expressive moments in my entire playthrough. Traitor's Caravan, which initially had me trailing the truck while figuring out the best way to approach it, suddenly had me questioning the mission specifics in the same way I did with Phantom Limbs. What if I could just go to the truck's starting point at the airport? Or in C2W, where I thought I was stripped of all equipment, trying to formulate a grand plan in which I would find explosives and then carefully sneak through the base, you know, the whole stealth thing. Until I realised that my helicopter still had its minigun, which led to an exciting, altogether more explosive run than I could have previously envisioned. And what's more, I got an S rank for it. I thought outside the box and the game rewarded me. Seriously, despite its reliance on previously used scenarios and its utterly woeful attempt at wrapping up the game's already lackluster story, Chapter 2 was some of the most fun I had in my entire time revisiting the Phantom Pain. Likewise, despite it feeling bogged down by different currencies and leagues that make it feel less influenced by Peace Walker's portability and more by free-to-play mobility, the FOB missions you unlock after Mission 22 see you without any buddy support, a severely limited reflex mode, against an army of soldiers and devices you don't come across in the main game, as well as taking the hollow structure of Mother Base and allowing you to get creative with how you navigate it. Again, you're forced to totally rethink your preconceived strategies, and it honestly makes for the most nail-biting, challenging moments you're likely to come across here. The game's online mode could have proved interesting as well. At this time, it was impossible to get a match outside of the bounty hunter mode. Most of those matches devolved into fairly basic shooting. Its lack of any meta progression outside of gear unlocks perhaps make things feel a little trivial, but it does a neat job of recontextualizing tools that had a specific purpose in the main game now that they're being utilized against real players. Ultimately though, and before we even get to the multiple issues with the game's story, these moments are blips in the grand scheme of things, a fraction of hours in a playtime that totaled nearly 100. I was so worn down by the constant repetition and poor design choices that literally anything to change things up felt comparatively gleeful. It's infuriating because at every stage you can see what the team at Kojima Productions was likely going for, but without trying to attribute artistic intent, it seems like they were scared or didn't have the resources to fully commit to any decision they made. The mission structure, the open world, the support functions of Mother Base. It's easy to imagine Kojima, with all his talk after each game about how he's done with the series, hastily implementing these features in response to criticisms of older features. What's that? They think the older games are too restrictive and linear? Well, give them everything and let them do whatever they want. We don't need to tell an interesting story here, the players will create their own. The problem here is twofold. For one, we've established that this isn't the case given the game's dominant strategy. The second problem is simply the fact that, upon replaying them for this piece, self-expression was never an issue in the previous games. Every Metal Gear Solid game since the first has experimented with various means of heightening player expression. Whether it be too simple messing with the set dressing approach, breaking the bottles or piling darts into some dafty's face is still fun to this day. Snake Eater's deeper emphasis on survival mechanics and giving you various tools to deal with each situation, followed by 4's weapons store allowing you to purchase only what you felt you needed. There's a clear arc to these incremental developments, making the world more responsive to player inputs, giving you more tools to take advantage of that responsiveness, allowing you control over how you acquired said tools, and finally with Peace Walker, control over your progression through the missions themselves. It was an open set of systems within an enclosed environment, giving each environment a defined start and end point and mostly allowing you the decisions over how to navigate the in-between. In fact, the amount of options available to the player has itself been a point of criticism in the past, with many tools feeling superfluous, but hey, they were included anyway for the player to have fun with if they so chose. Hell, even if you wanted to go down the silent, non-lethal route, that was a choice those older games allowed for. It was harder, with louder or more lethal options not suffering from the same drawbacks of tranquilized weapons, of having to reload after every shot, or silencer durability, or having to wait for a shot to take effect, etc. There was no real systemic advantage to taking the non-lethal route, but it acted as a test of skill for those that felt that they had mastered the systems. Thanks to their linearity, each scenario was more concentrated and carefully designed, allowing for more emergent moments of gameplay than you might imagine. For example, you've got to cross the guarded bridge. You read the guard's patterns before changing your camo setup to effectively hide yourself, maybe lure him to a certain point using magazines, and then shoot the beehive, which acts as a distraction for you to start crossing the bridge yourself. But alas, you notice 2 guards coming your way. You could try to trank them, or if perchance you miss, you might notice that you can shoot the ropes on the bridge itself, leading to a beautiful mess of physics sending the guards flying. In doing this, however, you then have to be careful when traversing the bridge yourself that you don't fall off. In this 5-minute sequence in a small environment super early in the game, you've already been afforded a wealth of tense situations and gameplay possibilities, allowing you to experiment with and exploit different systems to see how the AI would react and how you could take advantage of those outcomes. It ends up producing a little self-contained story that could end up slightly different for every player, even if the objective always remained the same. On top of all that though, through one simple gesture, having Snake mischievously smirk as he clocks the beehive, the game is flat out telling you to get wacky with it. Snake may be a gruff son of a bitch, but he isn't above messing about with his prey a bit. It's the same when he discovers the oil drum in 4. It might be humming of shite, but Snake isn't going to pass up an opportunity to roll into guards until he literally throws up. And the game gives you a long stretch of road to test that out on. I'm willing to bet very few people actually used the oil drum outside of that scenario. It's clunky, it causes a lot of noise, etc., but the fact it was in there says so much about the character as well as the design of that game. It's not restrictively linear, it's just focused. It wants you to mess around and have fun in the same way Snake wants to. In The Phantom Pain, however, there was a constant desire to mess around with more strategies than the game seemingly wanted me to. Every time I decided to go off-piste, throwing soldiers off of cliffs or blocking the road with my C4-riddled horse, surprising passers-by with an equine bomb, I always had that subtle tinge that I wasn't playing the game right. Older games were full of varied situations similar to the examples I mentioned. By comparison, and for all that its design attempts to put the player in control of the entire experience, The Phantom Pain sadly ends up feeling like the most restrictive Metal Gear Solid game to date. So I hope you enjoyed my first or third piece on The Phantom Pain. Like I say, the story analysis will be coming very soon, and oh boy, there's some stuff to talk about there. If you did enjoy the video, then why not hit subscribe or click the little bell thingy to see that video when it gets uploaded, and why not check out the podcast in the description. If you'd like to go the extra mile, however, you can support the show directly via Patreon. This has been one of the trickiest and most time-consuming pieces I've ever done for the channel, but thanks to your generous pledges, I've been able to give it that time, and for that I really cannot thank you enough. In particular, I'd like to thank Mark B. Writing, Artyom Vitsyuk, Spike Jones, Vasily Hrabinka, Travis Bennett, Julian McRoth, Zach Casserly, Leonardo Paley, Samuel Pickens, Tom Nash, Shardfire, Philip Lange, Rob, Rusty Shackelford, Danny James, Mosh, Anna Pimentel, Gang Leader, Jesse Ryan, Brandon Robinson, Diego Foxobuza, Justin's Holderness, Biggie Smith, Peter, Christian Kuhneman, Nico Blakely, Camel Traffic, and I'm super sorry for missing you out on that last video, please forgive me, Nicholas Ross, and Charlie Yang. And with that, I'm Hamish Black, and this has been Writing on Games. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.